Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and it's Tuesday, which means we are doing our tier list. So, it's the third week. We're going into this third week of the secluded spring season, and at this point, I think we fully understand which decks are the best, which decks aren't the best, you know? So this is going to be our final tier list, our final power rankings for all of the meta decks in Pokemon Pocket currently for the secluded springs season. We have about a couple of weeks left until the rank season ends, but I think not much is probably going to change. So this is going to be our final rankings, our final tier list. What you're looking at here is where we ranked all of the decks this format last week, but I do think a lot has actually changed since last week. I just don't really know if a whole lot is going to change after this week. If, you know, it turns out things change a lot, then we'll do our final tier list next Tuesday. But for right now, this is what we're going to be working with. We're going to be moving these decks around, editing this tier list, and then, you know, giving my final opinions. Feel free to use the timestamps down below. That's also where we will be including the energy types used for all of these deck lists. Hopefully this is going to be at least a little bit easy for you guys to see. I've zoomed in a little bit. I know the tier list format can confuse some people. Basically, it's a combination of two cards stacked up on each other. That's kind of how each image is. But I'll have an example of the deck listed down below my webcam. So while we're talking about a deck list, you'll be able to see it. And of course, we have the timestamps as well. Before we get into talking about the decks, I'm actually going to, we're going to like prune this tier list. We're going to clean it up a little bit because quite frankly, a lot of the decks on this tier list just aren't decks that really anybody plays anymore. Because basically as the season goes on, you know, decks that aren't necessarily performing very well just kind of fall out of play. And that's kind of what's happened to a lot of these decks. So we have to remove and kind of prune this tier list a little bit. So starting from, I guess, the bottom up, we'll just take out deck lists that honestly just aren't really seeing any play right now. If we go down to the D tier, I would say most of these decks probably aren't seeing any play. That's kind of why they were D tier. We'll probably leave Charizard, but Poliwrath, I just don't feel like ever, you know, really contended for a spot in this metagame. We're going to move it down to the not played tier. If we go down, Meowscarada is another cool example of a deck that did well early on this season, but quickly fell out of play, and then eventually nobody really ended up playing it. So Meowscarada is going to end up also going into the not played tier. And then unfortunately, I actually feel like Altaria is kind of, you know, fated for the same type of thing. It had a couple of pretty decent performances early on in the season, but just didn't really have enough performances over this past week to rank it on the tier list. So we're going to move it down to not played. The other thing, as we move into the C tier, a lot of these C tier decks also kind of fell out of favor, which is a bit unfortunate. We're using sort of this last week of tournament play as an example, because, you know, that's the most relevant data that we have so far to us from a timely perspective. And Donphan also just isn't seeing play. People aren't really playing Donphan anymore. And it's a little bit unfortunate, but I think that Rampardos decks kind of fell back into being Silvally Rampardos decks, which is still seeing a little bit of play, but Donphan just not a deck that anybody's really choosing to play. So we're going to move Donphan Rampardos down here into the non-play tier. Again, late in the season, things really start to thin out a little bit. In certain decks, honestly, people just stop playing them, either because there's other options or, you know, the decks aren't performing very well. So if nobody's playing them, we can't really rank them because they're not doing anything. Flareon and Leafeon actually also going down to the not played tier. Everybody playing Flareon is playing Turbo Flareon. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Flareon and Leafeon, unfortunately, just not a deck that is in the metagame currently, and that does feel a little bit disappointing. Next up, we have Solgaleo. People are still playing Solgaleo. People are still playing Dragonite. Giratina Latios is still seeing a little bit of play. I think it's one of the few sort of niche, like non-meta decks that, you know, continues to see a little bit of play, so we'll keep it on the tier list. Weavile is something that really jumped up as a pretty aggressive dark type deck, which, you know, had pretty good matchups into a lot of decks of the format, but quickly started to just not perform very well into the metagame, and then now, again, nobody is really playing it, so we'll move Weavile down to the not played tier. Again, we're definitely pruning a lot of this tier list. You know, that's just sort of the reality of things, unfortunately. What else do we have here that probably isn't seeing any more play? I think a lot of the Arceus decks are still seeing play. A lot of these Lightning decks are still seeing play. Let's double check here. Is there anything else that we could potentially include or declude from the tier list? I don't know if declude is a word. I think that's probably good. If we run into anything else, we'll just move it down to the not played tier. We have a couple of decks that weren't on the tier list last week, which is going to be the Raikou, Tapu, Koko sort of, you know, Raikou Toolbox Lightning deck list, which is my personal choice for the season. Then we also have that Silvally Zeraora, you know, just basic aggressive deck, which actually has risen up to be one of the more popular Lightning decks. Those will add to the tier list later on in the video. But at this point, I think we're good. I think we're good to start going here. We'll start from the top down, and I'll quickly kind of give my opinions on all of the decks here from S tier down to the D tier. Some decks will move, some decks might not move. It's just sort of how we do these updated tier lists as we go one by one and then we talk about them instead of building an entirely new tier list each time. So let's start with the S tier, right? So the S tier last week I had put, of course, Suicune and Giratina, Darkrai, and then Guzzlord was that sort of new inclusion up into the S tier. I still personally feel strongly about Guzzlord, but let's talk about Suicune and Giratina. Suicune and Giratina is by far the most played deck. This past weekend at the largest online tournament of the week, it had a 25% meta share, and then as we went into top cut, it was 42% of the meta share, meaning that basically, effectively speaking, in terms of decks that could compete to win that tournament, out of 350 decks, 42% of those decks were Suicune and Giratina, and ended up getting second place. This is still the dominant deck of the format, the best deck possibly of all time in Pokemon Pocket when we take a look at its overall win rate, success, and play rate this season. An incredibly ridiculous deck list that we've talked about so much here on the channel. We've done some gameplay on it, so if you want to go check out that video, you definitely can. But Suicune and Giratina, really the only way that people are playing Suicune has to stay in the S tier. It is the quintessential top deck of this format. This past weekend, it had a 50%, almost a 51% win rate, so it didn't perform exceedingly well, but you have to keep in mind that the entire season, the entire format right now is built around either playing Suicune or counter-playing Suicune, so to have a 50% win rate is still very, very impressive. Giratina Darkrai. This is a deck that was still S tier and going into the second week. It actually did win the largest tournament of this past week, and I still feel like Giratina Darkrai is a very, very solid choice. There's really two decks, I would say, at the top of the metagame that aren't necessarily they're the counter meta decks, right? So the way that the season breaks out, unfortunately, because Oricorio is really not a factor, what we have here is the #1 deck in the format, and then all of the decks that counterplay it, and that's really, it's a two-dimensional metagame, and I've talked about that, which we had previously, but ever since Oricorio was announced, or I guess put into the game, it's actually diversified the metagame quite a bit. But because the #1 deck kind of completely nullifies Oricorio, right? The Greninja just completely stomps Oricorio, then Oricorio hasn't really become a factor this season, which really kind of eliminates that diversity that we like to see into the metagame. I know a lot of people don't like Oricorio, but it really is one of the main things that makes the metagame diverse and healthy. Because it's not seeing play, unfortunately, Oricorio is just not much of a factor. And Giratina Darkrai is that #1 deck that's not Suicune. It has a good matchup into Suicune, and everybody knows it. It won this past weekend. It has to stay S tier. Giratina Darkrai, if you're not playing Suicune, it probably is your best choice. Last week, I kind of thought it might be Guzzlord because Guzzlord had won the largest tournament so far this season, and it continues to have a really high win rate. It was 9% of the meta share this past week and had a 54.5% win rate, actually amongst the highest out of all of these decks here throughout A and S tier. I really like Guzzlord. I think it probably still deserves an S tier mention. I just don't think any other deck so far this season has been performing at the rate that Guzzlord has in terms of its overall win rate. Again, it still won the largest tournament. It got 4 of the top 5 placements, I believe, this past weekend at the Jody's tournament, so it deserves to stay S tier. I still think Guzzlord is a phenomenal choice. Yet again, a card, both Giratina Darkrai and Guzzlord are decks that theoretically could be walled by Oricorio. But what's unfortunate is that Oricorio doesn't have that opportunity because Suicune is strong into Oricorio, right? So, or the Suicune deck is, right, because of Greninja. So again, that really creates an environment, this metagame, that it just really isn't that healthy. So yeah, Giratina, Darkrai, and Guzzlord are going to remain up here into the S tier. I don't really feel like I need to move any of these decks. They all perform exceedingly well. I think if you're trying to win a tournament, or if you're trying to climb to the highest reaches of the ranked season, if you're trying to get top 100 or whatever in Master Ball or top 1000, I think that these 3 decks are really your only true choices. And anything other than these 3 decks will make it exceedingly more difficult. So not to say it's not possible, but these are definitely by far the best options. So let's go down into the A tier, because I think that this is really where we're going to see a lot of shifts. Last week, going into the second week, it was this really awkward counter meta, aspect of the metagames, right? When we get into seasons, the second week is a lot about overcorrection, and then into the third week, things sort of balance back out, and we get a more of a detailed understanding of how these decks are actually positioned. So let's start off by talking about Tapu, Koko, and Oricorio. Tapu Koko and Oricorio was seemingly the best option that Oricorio had going into this season. Into the second week, it performed pretty well. It had a pretty good win rate into a lot of different decks. It seemingly was the top deck into Suicune and Greninja in terms of its win rate. However, that quickly changed. And decks like Giratina, Darkrai, Guzzlord, and Suicune all were able to modify their decks very slightly to drastically improve their matchup into Tapu Koko and Oricorio. 7 people played it. That's 2% of the meta share this past weekend at Jody's tournament, and it had a 38% win rate, which is a massive, massive drop-off. And again, I think it really just chalks it up to Tapu Koko being a really strong option, and being aggressive into those Suicune decks is a big deal. But Oricorio is a card that really can't do anything. Into Giratina Darkrai with the Nightmare Aura pings and the Rocky Helmet damage, Oricorio literally can't do enough damage to actually deal with Giratina Darkrai. The only way that you can beat Giratina Darkrai playing Oricorio is to play a bunch of healing cards, which unfortunately, or play Guzma, which we don't really have a lot of space for in Tapu Koko. And Tapu Koko itself is a card that really can't hang that well with Giratina Darkrai. It gets one-hit KO'd pretty easily. So this deck list has fallen off pretty dramatically. And I think a big reason for that is just Oricorio isn't a strong option right now, which, you know, is a negative aspect of this season. I really think so. Some people, it's funny because the same people that are going to argue that, you know, they don't like Oricorio are also the same people arguing that this season's metagame isn't that great. But a big reason why I would say that this current metagame isn't, you know, the most enjoyable metagame of all time, a big reason for that is because of Oricorio's lack of importance, or I guess viability this season. That's kind of how I feel about it. Tapu Koko Oricorio, I'm actually going to move down here to the C tier. I think that this is a deck list that I really would not recommend you play, and you're just going to struggle against a lot of the top decks that have, you know, adjusted their decks to be able to beat Oricorio a little bit more consistently. I think Tapu Koko is a great card, and I think that there's better ways to play Lightning decks. Tapu Koko Oricorio is going to go down here into the C tier. And that is where it is going to probably remain for this season unless something changes. Now, Turbo Flareon is a different example. This is a deck list that, you know, time and time again just sort of proves that it doesn't really care what its opponents are. All it cares about is if it gets its board state set up and starts one-hit KOing Pokemon. Flareon theoretically actually has a good win rate into Giratina Darkrai and Suicune, but because of the RNG nature of Flareon, it's never going to have like a crazy high win rate into those matchups, right? It's going to be decent, but it's going to fall pretty close to 50%. No matter what matchups it goes into. And honestly, I think that this is one of the quintessential A tier decks. I don't think it's necessarily close to being an S tier deck, but I think it's a very strong contender for that 4th or 5th best deck so far this season. Continuously floating a little bit above 50%, I would say about a 51 to 52% win rate deck list. It's a fast-paced deck, it's an RNG deck, it's a high roll deck. Turbo Flareon really is the best way to play Flareon, and it's the best fire type deck in the game, and it has been for the last few seasons. One of the prime examples of a deck list that really does benefit from baby Pokemon, which she's playing a variety of different decks, but I would say currently right now with Greninja everywhere, the baby Pokemon really are more of a liability than anything, similar to Oricorio, which I find to be, again, very disappointing considering how much investment, you know, the developers put in to those baby Pokemon. They just sort of ended up being kind of a no factor this season because Greninja absolutely dominated the metagame. But Turbo Flareon's kind of the exception to that. It's explosive. It can be super fast paced and just very, very strong in the early game. It doesn't really care what its matchups are. It's going to stay into the A tier. I think it's a very decent quality A tier deck list. Now, Silvally Rampardos is a very interesting example. I put this deck into the A tier because, again, in that second week, it was performing exceedingly well, and I thought that it had a good enough matchup into all of the S tier decks, while also, of course, having a favorable matchup into this Oricorio deck that saw a lot of play. But again, a bit of an overcorrection into that second week, and I think as we went into the third week, Silvally Rampardos really kind of showed its, you know, its downside, being an overall less consistent deck than you want it to be. Has not been performing that well, and it's been pretty much under 50% ever since its sort of little run it had into that second week. So I like Silvally Rampardos. I think that it's probably a B tier deck. I wouldn't consider this to be in that A tier, but it is still a real deck. It can still win games. Not something I would recommend above anything that we put above it on the tier list, but definitely not a horrible deck. We're gonna put it right there into the B tier, and I feel pretty good about that. Next up is Buzzwole. And the interesting thing about Buzzwole, unfortunately, is kind of the same thing as Silvally Rampardos. I think it was basically an example of a deck that had a little bit of a pretty good run into that second week, but then quickly, fell back into place as a deck list that really just isn't that well positioned against the best decks of the metagame. I think that it's going to be really good against Giratina Darkrai and Guzzlord. I think those are two matchups that it can do very well with, but against Suicune, against Turbo Flareon, and against a lot of the other high roll decks in the format, Buzzwole really just can't keep up. Flareon is definitely going to keep it in check, but some of these more aggressive lightning type decks, or even Espeon and Sylveon, which is still seeing a little play, kind of hard wall Buzzwole pretty significantly. So I think that Buzzwole is still a fine deck list. This past weekend, it saw about 2% meta share, and it went 13 and 17, so it didn't perform that well. I think Buzzwole, again, is a pretty solid B tier deck. I'm actually going to compare it very accurately, or very similarly to Silvally Rampardos in terms of its overall position in the metagame. We're going to move it down there into the B tier. Next up is going to be Greninja and Oricorio, another deck list that was kind of a remnant of that first week. It has since basically just fallen off. I think that there's a couple of reasons for that. The main one, of course, being that, yes, we have kind of auto-win potential into Giratina Darkrai. That really is the calling card for Greninja and Oricorio. It's an Oricorio deck that can deal extra damage with Greninja, but also can utilize 2 copies of Irida to stay alive. It is much more of a control type deck list, other than the other lightning decks that are a bit more of aggressive decks that just play Oricorio. This strategy for Oricorio actually makes a lot of sense, but it's a deck that is going to massively struggle against basically everything in the game that isn't Giratina Darkrai. So this is a deck that specifically does beat Giratina Darkrai, which means it does have potential for sure, but Giratina Darkrai isn't the #1 deck. It's far from the most played deck so far this season. And if we're not doing well into Suicune, which unfortunately Greninja Oricorio does not do well into Suicune, then it just can't really be justified as an A tier deck, quite frankly. So this is another deck that's going to fall down into the B tier. And the reason why you might be wondering why this deck is bad against Suicune is just the draw power, right? So you're also playing Greninja, but you're playing Oricorio. So in theory, you should be able to, counter a big portion of the Suicune deck, right? Suicune can't damage Oricorio, neither can Giratina, but Greninja can. And since Suicune's in the active spot, soaking up damage and drawing a bunch of cards, it's much more likely that they get their Greninja out before you can, which basically means you lose the game. And that's kind of how it goes, right? Greninja's just going to steamroll your Oricorios. And if they can get Greninja out before you can, which they oftentimes do because they're trying so many more cards, then that matchup ends up just being really, really bad. Whereas Greninja Oricorio is a deck that loves to go into the late game. Against Suicune is not that matchup. You do not want to go into the late game against Suicune and Greninja and Giratina because it is by far the best late game deck in the game. So yeah, Greninja Oricorio I think is totally fine. But again, it's going to be right there into the B tier next to Buzzwole and Silvally Rampardos. These are 3 decks that performed well in that second week, but unfortunately just haven't done much ever since, right? It was that overcorrection, and now they've kind of fallen back to where I think they truly belong, which is in that B tier, which is, not bad, but realistically not, not A tier material, I guess, in my mind. Next up, though, we have Dragonite. So here's the thing about Dragonite. Some people might not really agree with me because it's not a deck that sees like a ton of play. It saw, about 2% of the meta share, but Dragonite continues to do well. Dragonite is one of the deck lists that just actually doesn't care what's going on in the metagame. When you have 180 HP and you deal 180 damage, the only thing you have to worry about is getting your board state set up, right? It's very similar to Flareon, but it can contend in the late game, whereas Flareon really depends on having that hot start in the early game. It puts itself actually in a very unique position against a deck like Giratina Darkrai, like Suicune. It can actually hang. It can actually do its thing in the late game and still win games, even if it doesn't get off to like a really fast-paced start. But it does have that turn 3 potential that we, of course, all know and love about the old rare candy, baby Pokemon combo, right? I mean, it is just a massive high roll deck. It's an RNG deck. And when I say high roll, I mean decks that literally, there's no in between. When I call a deck a high roll deck, it has tremendous potential, but also has awful potential if it doesn't do what it wants to do, right? So Dragonite either does more than any other deck, or it does literally nothing. That's why it is a high roll deck. It's a true deck that relies on getting one specific combo out, and if it can work, it works. If not, it doesn't work. But uniquely enough, that particular type of deck list actually ends up being pretty good into the metagame. So even though Dragonite isn't nearly the most played deck, again, it's about 2% of the tournament meta share, and I don't think that many people are playing it in ranked mode, I'm actually going to put it into the S tier. I think that this deck deserves to see more play. And I think that because of the way that the season's going right now, you would rather play decks that either just don't care what they're going up against, or you're just playing the strongest decks. And honestly, that's kind of what we're seeing reflected here in the S tier and the A tier so far. These high roll decks, Turbo Flareon and Dragonite, just end up not really caring. They just don't care. They don't care what goes on. They don't care what their opponent is. All they care about the cards that they draw into. And I think that they both have had really good results and win rates over the last couple of weeks. So Dragonite going up into the A tier, some people might not agree with that because it's not seeing a ton of play, but honestly, I'm telling you, it deserves to see more play, especially in a tournament scenario. In ranked battles, you know, who knows, right? But in tournament play, I think you have a good of a chance of winning playing Dragonite than really anything, which I think is pretty funny. So Dragonite going into the A tier. Next up, we have Turbo Dark Arceus. And you know what, guys? I feel the exact same way about Turbo Dark Arceus that I do these other decks, right? So Turbo Dark Arceus is really like, this is a spectrum, right? This is like what I call like the high roll spectrum, where these are decks that have to do one thing in particular. And if they do those things, then they do very well. But if they don't, then they struggle pretty tremendously, right? But there's a spectrum to that. I would say that Turbo Dark Arceus is probably the most consistent at getting that particular combo out, but it has the least damaging upside. Arceus hitting for 130 is a pretty big deal. With Darkrai pinging at the same time, yes, you can deal 150. That's pretty strong, but Turbo Flareon can hit to 170, 160 pretty easily with EV Bag and Red, whereas Dragonite hits for 180, right? So these are all high roll decks, but they have a spectrum of consistency as well as a spectrum of power. You know what I mean? But they're all effectively the same type of deck, and I think that's definitely kind of unique about them. So these are the high roll decks, and honestly, the high roll decks consistently perform well in the metagame, even though they don't see that much play. I don't think people love the play style here, but all of these decks utilize baby Pokemon, and that's what baby Pokemon are being used for right now. Basically, high roll turbo strategies that can power up Pokemon tremendously quickly to overpower your opponent, or they don't do anything and then you lose. You know what I mean? So like that's the unique thing about these deck lists. But to be fair, I think they're all A tier potential decks just because they don't really care what they go up against. They always have that potential to beat their opponents. And I think that's pretty unique for sure. Next up is going to be Turbo Lightning Arceus right here. So that's Arceus with Pichu. So this is, you know, again, an interesting deck list. So very similar to Turbo Dark Arceus in that sense, where it's like a Turbo, you know, Arceus deck where you can technically attack turn 2 with Arceus. But the downside to this deck list here is that you don't have any other options, right? When you're playing Dark Energies, you can play Darkrai and Arceus, which are two very similar Pokemon in what they're able to achieve with the baby Pokemon combos. When you're playing Turbo Lightning Arceus, we don't have a lot of those types of Pokemon. You could play Pikachu, but then you discard all of your energies and Pikachu gets revenge KO'd pretty easily. So when we're playing Turbo Lightning Arceus, we're playing Pichu and Zeraora and Arceus, very consistent on getting that Arceus set up. But then we're also playing Oricorio. Like, this deck list plays 2 copies of Oricorio, and as we know, Oricorio doesn't do anything really this season. So unfortunately, this deck list actually is a lot worse, I would say, than the Turbo Dark Arceus, just because like the Oricorio stuff doesn't help you. Zeraora can be a decent leadoff option into, of course, into Suicune, right? Going first, you can deal 70 damage, hitting from weakness to a KOing Suicune. Zeraora is actually a pretty good card, but I think it sees a lot more success in other decks and other variants, and I just don't really believe it's doing extremely well with this Arceus. Turbo Lightning Arceus is what this archetype is. I actually don't feel very strongly about it because it's an Oricorio deck. I'm going to keep this into the B tier, but this is going to be like a bottom B tier option. I don't think it's bad enough to put it into the C tier, but again, Oricorio is not a helpful card, right? If you lead Oricorio into Suicune, like, you're going to lose. They're just going to play Irida, they're going to heal, they're going to draw cards, get Greninja set up, and then you're going to get steamrolled. It just doesn't work, right? Our only effective Pokemon in this deck is like Zeraora in the active going first, or of course getting that Arceus combo. But hitting for 130, you're not KOing Suicune, and Suicune's just going to, it's just going to roll through you, unfortunately. So Turbo Lightning Arceus, definitely not a really strong contender. I'm going to put it at the bottom of B tier, but it's kind of floating around that C tier to B tier line, quite honestly. Next up is going to be Poison Guzzlord. So this is one of the more interesting things to rank so far this season, because Poison Guzzlord isn't a bad deck whatsoever. I think that most people agree that the better way to play it, though, is to just play Control Guzzlord or, 17 Trainer Guzzlord. It's a much better matchup into Suicune. It's a much more consistent deck list. When you were playing Naganadel and all of the poison stuff, like, that fast-paced aggression can be really strong. It's a card that is exceptionally good into when your opponent leads Giratina, It's also exceptionally good into Espeon Sylveon, but unfortunately Espeon Sylveon is no longer the #1 deck of the metagame. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but had a massive fall off. That Naganadel can actually be really strong into the aggressive lightning type decks as well, but in general, I would say that if you're playing Guzzlord, you just don't really need to play this poison variant. There's just a much better version of it that's more consistent and better into the most played decks of the season, right? So that's the awkward part about this deck. I don't actually feel like it's that bad, but I just don't really feel like anybody's choosing to play this version of this deck because there's a very similar version that inherently just is better. I don't know how else to say it. So we're going to keep Guzzlord down here. Excuse me. We're going to keep Guzzlord down here into the B tier. That's Poison Guzzlord. Again, we have a 17 trainer kind of straight control Guzzlord up here into the S tier. So that's the only thing. This deck probably would have like A tier potential if like other people just weren't playing Guzzlord this way. But I think because not many people are really playing it, it's not a horrible deck. It's just got to go down into the B tier. Next up is Umbreon though. Let's talk about Umbreon. I actually really like Umbreon. I think that it has a lot of potential. But again, it's a deck list that probably won't catch on very well. It's another deck that actually is a specific counterplay to a lot of the top decks because they play mostly just basic Pokemon. So Umbreon has that ability with the non-EX Umbreon to basically lock your opponent out of being able to attack you while you deal chip damage and then finish the game with Umbreon EX. That's actually a pretty sound strategy, and I think it's very well positioned in the metagame. Again, it's really hard for me to give this like an A tier placement just because not many people are playing Umbreon, even though I do actually feel like it's a pretty solid option. If you're playing a dark type deck, you're probably playing Guzzlord or Giratina Darkrai or Turbo Dark Arceus. So as far as the dark type decks go, Umbreon just really doesn't see that much play, so we have to keep it out of the A tier, unfortunately. We're going to put it like high B tier, though. I actually feel like it's one of the better decks in the game right now, which is funny. It just, I think, in my mind, deserves to see a little bit more play. Lastly, though, in the B tier, we have Espeon and Sylveon. So do I think Espeon and Sylveon deserves to move out of the B tier or like go up or down? That's the weird thing about Espeon. It was incredibly strong. Espeon Sylveon was incredibly strong last season. It counterplayed a lot of decks, and it just was an incredibly consistent deck list that did very well, but I think that the Suicune stuff really kind of took over when the Legendary Beasts came out. There was just Pokemon that could also heal, but also draw cards at the same time. And the downside of playing Espeon Sylveon is that we don't deal a ton of damage, so against other decks that can heal pretty effectively, but also deal a lot of damage, it just made things a little bit tougher, right? Against Suicune, we struggled, and especially Guzzlord, which really rose up as one of the most played decks. This season, we also struggle against it. Turbo Dark Arceus, Darkrai is everywhere, quite frankly. Turbo Flareon can one-hit KO all of your Pokemon, so can Dragonite. So it really wasn't a great season right now, or a great, format for Espeon Sylveon. Now, I don't feel like it's a bad deck. In fact, I'm going to put it like right here, like middle. I'll just put it like middle B tier. I think that it, again, is a totally fine option, but not something that is necessarily very well positioned. It's just an inherently strong, consistent deck, but a deck that just isn't, it's not particularly strong against, any of the most played decks. So it doesn't have like anything really going for it from a matchup perspective. So it's going to stay there into the B tier. All right, let's move down to some of these C tier decks and see if they move in or up or down because, I think that's what maybe some people are curious about. Who knows? We're at 27 minutes, so we'll move a little bit quickly here. We have Raikou and Magnezone. The funny thing about Raikou Magnezone is that it consistently does pretty well in terms of placing in tournaments, but it's not a deck list that ever has a consistently high win rate. It's basically... I forgot my alert box was on. Somebody just followed on Twitch, I think, for some reason. I'm not live or anything. That was random. Okay, anyway. Sorry about that. Shout out to whoever just followed me on Twitch. I forgot to mute the alert box. That's pretty funny. Okay, anyway, Raikou Magnezone. Again, a deck list that people still continue to play. The issue with the lightning type stuff is that there's so many different lightning type decks, and it's really hard to nail down which one you should be playing. I think there's a lot of different options, and they have a lot of different strengths. Raikou Magnezone is more of a late game lightning type deck, which is interesting because, a lot of the lightning type decks really, their strength is being really fast paced and aggressive in the early game. Magnezone is a bit of a late game card, but with the flex of Magneton and Elemental Switch, you can, of course, be a little bit aggressive with Raikou, especially going first. I like this deck. I do. I just don't feel like it's like as good as some of the other lightning type decks. I still believe that to be the case. I am personally pretty high on Raikou. Like Suicune, it draws cards while it's in the active spot, right? And that's inherently pretty good, right? Now, we hopefully will get maybe some other Pokemon to pair, some other like strong, like bench-sitting stage 2 rare candy combo lightning Pokemon to pair with Raikou, like Suicune has with Greninja. But Magnezone, I think, fits that bill okay. That's really it. I just feel like it's okay. Anyway, Magnezone is going to go up here into the B tier. I think it's like a middle of the road B tier deck. I'm just going to put it like right here. I think that, yeah, Raikou Magnezone is totally fine. I don't feel exceptionally strong about it. I think there's better lightning type decks. In fact, I think there's better Raikou decks, honestly. That's kind of how I feel about it. But anyway, there we go. Next up is going to be Turbo Silvally. So the interesting thing actually about Turbo Silvally is that people aren't playing it like they were before. So, you know, interestingly enough, actually, we're going to move Turbo Silvally, which is with Pichu. We're going to move it down into the not played tier. The reason for that is because we actually have another like Turbo Silvally type deck list that is seeing more play. That basically is the same deck, but just a little bit different, right? So this deck list here was kind of the top way to play Pichu or top way to play Silvally like last season, but has kind of fallen off pretty dramatically. Just nobody's really playing Silvally this way. So yeah, we're going to remove it. It's going to go into the not played tier. Next up, though, what do we have? We have Raikou and Arceus. So yeah, also kind of a deck that probably isn't really seeing any play. I think that most people playing Raikou with Elemental or Electrical Cord and setting up for that late game attacker is kind of just playing like Pikachu and Tapu Koko and Zeraora and stuff. Like that's really where this archetype kind of falls into. Some people were playing Arceus before they were playing Pikachu and Tapu Koko, but I think in general, like Arceus just isn't as strong of a Pokemon right now. We would rather just discard all of the energies and play Pikachu and not have a retreat cost of 2 and have to worry about it. So I think that this deck list also going down into the not played tier. Honestly, there's nothing to say about it. There's just similar decks that have kind of taken the spot for it. So anyway, moving down to the not played tier. Next up is going to be Giratina and Latios. So this is yet again a deck list that I think Frog EX Numentale, I can never say his name, did really well with actually at our tournament a couple of weeks ago. He placed fairly well. I don't think this is like a real contending deck. Like I think that this is more of a novelty than anything. And a strong player placed well with it once, but ever since it's kind of been struggling. Some people played it this past weekend, but they had a 40% win rate with it. So we're going to keep it down here into the C tier. I just don't really feel like it's a real contending deck. It's more of, again, more of a novelty, more of like a meme type deck, a fringe meta deck. That is cool. Very, very cool. It does have some synergistic play styles with it. The Pokemon do kind of pair together fairly well. It's just not like, it just doesn't do what it needs to do, quite frankly. Solgaleo and Entei, another deck list that is still holding on. People love to play Solgaleo. Whenever, you know, somebody saw that Solgaleo did well in a small tournament and theoretically had a pretty good matchup into some of the top decks, it really kind of caught on. But ever since people really started to play it, you know, after that first week, it really has fallen off. It's dramatically doing worse in terms of its overall win rate than mostly any other deck in the metagame. This past weekend, it had a 35% win rate. So Solgaleo, unfortunately, is actually moving down into the D tier, which feels kind of bad. But yeah, Solgaleo is not something that you should be playing. I really genuinely believe that. Do not play Solgaleo. It's not something that I would really recommend to any stretch of the imagination. Next up is going to be Dragonite, but this is going to be Dragonite like without Sylveon. Again, interestingly enough, because people are still playing this deck list, I still think it's better to play Dragonite with Sylveon, but quite frankly, you can play Dragonite without it, and it's still a decent deck, right? I think that in general, it's a little bit more consistent in terms of getting the energies that you need, but you have to, of course, just draw into, you know, your evolution Pokemon and rare candy. So it's a deck list that doesn't have the same turn 3 potential, but will get where it wants to go on turn 4 a bit more consistently. So it's really just two sides of the same coin. That is Dragonite. Dragonite itself is fairly well positioned. This deck list actually went 7-6 this past weekend, so 2 people played it, had a 53.5% win rate. I'm going to go ahead and just put it into the B tier. I don't have a lot of strong feelings about Dragonite without Sylveon. I think it's better to play it with Sylveon, but hey, you know, it's still Dragonite, and it still doesn't care what you do. It's just going to try to get set up and then beat you. So there we go. Yeah, Dragonite going into the B tier and then Dragonite Sylveon going into the A tier. Again, much more condensed right now, right? The metagame is a lot more streamlined than it was early on in the season. And that's just because of the two-factor nature of this current metagame. Lastly, though, we have Charizard. Well, not lastly, but, you know, we have these two decks, but Charizard here into the D tier. What are we going to do about Charizard? Are we going to talk about it? Are we going to play it? Are we going to rank it? People still try to play Charizard, but similarly to Solgaleo, I think these are two deck lists that don't deal enough damage. Like Charizard can't KO a lot of Pokemon with Giant Cape. With Greninja, with Suicune, like Charizard just isn't consistent enough. It's not fast enough. It's going to get 2-hit KO'd pretty easily, and Suicune hits it for weakness. Guzzlord as well is a card that traditionally counterplays Charizard just because it can discard energies. And some of these turbo decks are just going to outpace Charizard. So for the very similar reason, even though these are two very different decks, Solgaleo and Charizard are both D tier decks right now. I think what we're seeing is that rare candy isn't a reliable option to set up your main attacking Pokemon in the active spot. If you rely on your rare candy combo to set up your active attacking Pokemon, you're realistically not going to be doing that well unless that Pokemon is something like Dragonite, which doesn't have to worry about anything other than just KOing, right? So we're now in a weird position to where things like Dragonite are actually exceptionally better than things like Charizard and Solgaleo, even though they're still stage 2 Pokemon with 180 HP. Dragonite just can actually take KOs, and that's really all you have to worry about, whereas things like Solgaleo and Charizard aren't actually able to take KOs. So the trade-off of being inconsistent and slower doesn't really balance out when you're still struggling to KO stuff, and you also have to struggle with the consistency of stuff. So yeah, Solgaleo, Charizard are really the D tier options right now, I would say, in terms of decks that are seeing play, and I find that to be pretty funny. Okay, so lastly, what we're going to do is rank these two new deck lists. So we have the Raikou Tapu Koko Toolbox decks, which Limitless categorizes under two different decks, whether you're playing 2 Tapu Koko or 1 Tapu Koko. It categorizes it as either Raikou and Pikachu or Raikou and Tapu Koko. I think these are really strong deck lists. This is my #1 choice so far this season, not in terms of which deck I think is the best deck, but in terms of which deck list I personally enjoy playing. So this is the deck that I just kind of really latched onto. So when I grind on the ranked ladder, when I go live on Twitch or on YouTube, like, this is the deck I play because I have the most fun with it. And I think it's probably one of the more one of the more ethical decks so far, I would say, this season. It's a counter meta deck list, but isn't exceptionally overpowered, and it doesn't necessarily completely hard counter anything in the format. It's just a deck that is consistent enough, it's aggressive enough, has a lot going for it. It has a lot of moving pieces, but if you can play this deck and you can play it consistently and you can make all of the right choices, I think it's actually a really strong deck. So if you want to see this deck in action, go check out our live streams. We actually will be going live tonight as well on YouTube and on Twitch. So, shout out to the Discord as well. Go to the Discord so you can stay notified on all of that stuff. Everybody in the community knows my feelings about this deck list, but honestly, in terms of its actual viability ranking, I'm going to put it into the A tier. I think it's kind of a mid to bottom A tier deck list. I think it's really the only deck. Well, it's not the only deck, but it might be, actually. It might be really the only deck list that isn't just a pure high roll deck that has a good enough position or is, enough going for it to contend with either the strongest decks here in S tier or these high roll deck lists. I think it's a really unique deck. It's really one of the only decks that isn't, inherently stronger than everything else or just pure high roll. And I think that's a really unique aspect about this deck list. Consistently has a high win rate. It had a 52% win rate this past week and is consistently above 50%. Again, it has a winning matchup in a Suicune. It does struggle a bit against Guzzlord and Giratina Darkrai, but not enough to where it really matters that much for me. I like this deck list a lot. I'm going to put it right here into the A tier. Next up, though, is Silvally and Zeraora. So this was actually the most played Lightning deck of the week. Every week, a new Lightning deck kind of emerges and people try to play it. But unfortunately, I just don't feel like this deck list has enough going for it. If you're playing the Zeraora stuff, I think Raikou is just a bit better. And I like the electrical cord strategies. This is a very similar deck to Raikou and Tapu Koko. Unfortunately, though, it went 42 and 57. So it had a 42% win rate this past week. It actually underperformed pretty dramatically. And I think it really was sort of just the flavor of the week that some people were high on, but just really not a deck that I think is well positioned enough from a counter meta perspective or just sort of an overall power scaling perspective. So this deck list here, Silvally and Zeraora, which again has kind of taken up the spot of other Silvally deck lists, I think is also just a B tier deck. I'm going to put it right here, middle B tier, because I'm not that strong on it. Honestly, if you're playing a lightning type deck, play the Raikou toolbox stuff, play Tapu Koko, play Raikou, play Zeraora, play Pikachu, and you can kind of technically do everything, even though you're not always doing what you want to do, you at least have that potential. And I think it's really the only deck that kind of has that going for it, which is weird. But anyway, here we go. This is really the tier list. So everything in the not played tier just has fallen off. People don't play it anymore. So really what we're looking at is just right here. I can zoom in so you guys can see it. This is really all the metagame is right now, is just these deck lists here. Again, S tier is Suicune, Greninja, Giratina Darkrai, and Guzzlord. These are not only the 3 most played decks, but by far, I would say the most contending deck lists. Suicune, Giratina, by far the strongest deck and the most played deck. Giratina, Darkrai, and Guzzlord are the 2 top meta counterplays to Suicune and Greninja. Also have a high enough win rate against the other stuff in the format that they don't really have to worry about getting counterplayed, which puts them in a very unique position, which I think also kind of puts them into the S tier potential. When you take a look at all of the major tournament winners so far this season, these are the 3 decks that have won, and I don't think that's any surprise. If you go down into the A tier, these are the decks that are either specifically strong into Suicune and Giratina, or just, again, don't really care what they go up against. They're kind of outside of the, the matchup data perspective. They just sort of play their games, they do their thing, and they win, other than Raikou, Tapu, Koko, which I think really is, and I've been saying it for quite some time, the top real counter meta deck. Like, I know, like, the dark type decks do counter Suicune, but they don't really feel like counter meta decks. They just are decks that I guess, happen to be strong in a Suicune. I don't know. I guess it doesn't really matter, but this is the best lightning deck in my mind and is probably the most fun deck to play, I would say. Yeah, everything in the B tier, these are all fine decks. Everything in the B tier, is totally fine. I don't feel very strongly about it. These are decks that consistently don't perform that well, but if they were to do well, if you were to tell me, hey, I got to Master Ball and a, 96% win rate with these decks, like, sure, whatever, I'll believe you. It is what it is. Like, you can play any of these decks in the B tier. I have all of the respect for you. They're not bad decks whatsoever. I just think they're a notch below the decks here in S tier and in A tier. C tier and D tier is actually pretty thin. I think that Tapu, Koko, Oricorio, and Giratina and Latios, like, these are decks that, are like, I don't feel like they belong in B tier, but I also feel like they don't belong in D tier. So that's why they sort of just found their way into the C tier. Like, we could have thinned out the C tier a little bit, but honestly, I like to give a lot of the decks the nod. So anyway, there to go. And then the D tier decks, these are like the rare candy attacking Pokemon decks that are just really bad, but people love it. They love to play Solgaleo. They love to play Charizard. They're just, these are people's favorite Pokemon. They love playing them, but they're inherently inconsistent and lack the power that they need to be viable in the metagame. So there you go, guys. There it is. This is kind of my final power rankings of this metagame. And like I said, we're in week 3. So all of the data that we have so far, I would say is pretty reliable. It's pretty consistent. We might do another tier list if like a new deck pops up and it completely changes the metagame, and if things really shift, we'll do another tier list, but I really feel like this is what we're looking at right now from a meta deck viability perspective. These are our final power rankings of the Secluded Spring season. I would love to hear what you guys' opinions are. Probably as we go into that 4th week and we wait for, news and updates in the next season to come out, I'll probably do a lot of retrospective content, and I'll do a lot of, more constructive criticism of the metagame and Pokemon Pocket in general. I think that we have a lot of big updates coming, and I would love to kind of have the community share their opinions and get that out so maybe the developers or people in the community can see it and maybe make the correct changes to make the game better. Overall, I would say that this metagame, and I've said it time and time again, feels a little bit less fun than other metagames. I think that the dominance of the Greninja Cyrus stuff feels quite bad. I think that Suicune is just a very, very strong card, and unfortunately, the #1 deck in the metagame is strong into Oricorio, and the removal of Oricorio in the meta has drastically reduced the overall viability of a lot of different deck lists. Overall, making the metagame less healthy, and I really do chalk a lot down to Oricorio. I think a big reason why the last, 2, 3, 4 metagames have been so fun is because Oricorio has had at least some play in the metagame, and it has some viability. Unfortunately, this season, Oricorio just doesn't really do it for us. So anyway, guys, there we go. Comment down below. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? I would love to hear your guys' opinions. Don't forget to comment down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, stay tuned. We will be doing more live streams, so go check out the twitch.tv channel. Link will be down in the description below, but we're also going live on YouTube. So for those people that want to just support on YouTube or watch the live stream, definitely come and tune in. Let's get out of here. This was still a 40-minute video. I don't know how to shorten videos. I really don't. I just like to talk a lot. Peace out, guys. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. Thanks for all of the support. We'll see you guys next time. And yeah. Bye.